So I'm Luke Faye. I'm Managing Director at Treework Environmental Practice. We're a small practice, but probably a medium-sized practice in arboricultural terms. There's 14 of us. Instinctively, we all know that trees, whether we are experts or not, that trees depend on soil, just like they depend on water and light to thrive. But when you get down to an expert level, you start to look at, well, how do trees draw up the nutrients they need from the soil in order that they can be healthy? And then you start to realize that, okay, for tree roots to be effective in drawing up those nutrients, they need to form symbiotic relationships with microorganisms, whether they be bacteria or fungi or other microorganisms within the soil. And a healthy soil is teeming with these microorganisms. The more I hear about how that functions in a healthy system, the more I understand that these are every part of drawing those nutrients out of the soil is entirely dependent on those interactions with the microbes. So, for instance, bacteria on the tip of the feeding root will be helping to turn the nutrients into a form that the root can draw up, for instance. So where soil then starts to become unhealthy, where there's an imbalance in the organisms, or there's potentially a reduction in the number of microorganisms or the diversity of the microorganisms, then the soil can become unhealthy, and that can have a knock-on effect on the tree's ability to draw the nutrients and water out of the soil that it needs. The Sustainable Soils Alliance has brought together people in food production, politicians, people in arboriculture, in land management, agriculture. Think of all of the spheres that are dependent on soil, whether it be planting in the urban environment or in landscape or historic landscapes or sheep farming or forestry. All of these activities and functions of our society are dependent on soil. So the Sustainable Soils Alliance is drawing all of those, the representative bodies of all of those sectors together to look at, well, what is the state of our soils now? What are the threats to healthy soils? And what are the options and opportunities for improving the soils and addressing those threats? So part of that is also, as well as influencing government and policy makers and decision makers through at the highest level that we can, the other thing is developing a knowledge base and an evidence base, and through our scientific panels. I think that's a really good point, isn't it? We don't know, and there's so many effects of that. And of course, it's in the context of a real need for housing. So, again, that elevates the discussion to, the highest policy, UK-wide level. That we need to understand the drivers and the drivers that are for those things that are threatening our soil ecosystem and the benefits that we gain from that, and but also then what other options are there need to be researched and understood. So that might sound like a bit of an evasive answer, but what I'm saying is that there's bound to be an impact. There's bound to be an impact not just on soils, but also on their function in terms of flood risk mitigation and in terms of greenhouse gases, and in terms of biodiversity. So that's bound to be the case, but what is the context for that, and what the true impact of that is quite difficult to quantify. It's tricky. It's really tricky. You're weighing up, some aspirations around, retaining what would you call it? It's kind of the infrastructure of soil and organic matter, if you like, and plants, which can seem to a construction manager who needs to worry about health and safety, program and budget, can seem like a bit of an impediment and a distraction in the context of needing space to work safely and rapidly. And so how can one make that sufficiently valuable to make it a reasonable offset when considering for a construction manager who has all these other considerations, to consider it as worth protecting. Or maybe we need to think a bit differently about our methods for protecting that enable access to that space during construction, but also retain and good quality soil at the end of it. I don't know. I mean, and maybe there's some innovation to be done in that area. There's a great quote in the CPD I do, which I think is William Blake. No, it is William Blake, but I think it says I think something along the lines of, the tree to one man is a glorious thing, and to another is just something in the way with branches or something. It's words to that effect, and and that's what in the 1700s. And it's a very good observation. It's still true now, and there's a lot more space there. What I think is that if we really want to encourage people to value trees more, then there's the gut and the heart that we need to go to first, which is actually best addressed as when we're children. One of the most, I'd say, moving things I've done professionally recently was going to a local school to me in Peckham in southeast London for a careers evening. And there was, I think, 100 professionals from different professions there. And none of them were in trees. Which isn't surprising to anybody. And then I was interviewed by pairs of young students, about 14, from the area. And I'd asked them a few questions. I'd first of all find out that they didn't know what an arboriculturalist was, because no one knows what an arboriculturalist was. But I could break it down a little bit. If they learned Spanish or French or something, we could kind of build the word up and understand what it was. And I taught them through how I got into the industry. Or no, they asked me how I got into the industry. And then I talked to them about that. And but at some point I would ask, so just to put this in context, did you see the trees on your walk to school this morning? And they didn't. And I'd put it again in context. Do you realise that someone has inspected each one of those trees and chose to plant them in those locations and is responsible for them? And of course, then they don't, because we don't look up. And so it's a really simple, early approach to say, well, okay, count the trees on your way to school. Tell me what there is. Tell me, do you know, if I showed you this leaf, could you recognize it? Less people are aware that there are people who manage trees, or that that's an option for them in life, is to be a person consults on and advises on and manages trees. And I think that's something that I'm really keen to be working more on. I'm working with the Construction Youth Trust to develop exercises to slot into the national curriculum that relate back to trees, relate back to arboriculture and construction. And I'm doing more and more of these career days because I think they're really valuable. They're valuable not just to the children, I think they're valuable to me. That's fascinating. I think, for me, in my role in tree work, if I can develop and maintain an organisation that's a group of experts and provide a working environment in which those dedicated experts can flourish, then I think that's a great thing to have achieved and would make me very happy. I've come to a time now when actually my expertise is dwarfed by the expertise of my colleagues in terms of arboriculture. So, it's what I learn from them that is really rewarding. And yeah, like I say, if I can enable that, then that's really rewarding in itself. And I think for me also, I'm looking well beyond when I'm involved in arboriculture. I feel that, we talk about, or we should talk about succession. All industries should talk about succession. And, for me then, Treework Environmental Practice needs to be a entity that exists well beyond, my life. And so, yes, how do you make that a solid foundation where the people maybe who I'm meeting now at careers days may be the experts and directors of Treework Environmental Practice in 20 years' time or 30 years' time. Yeah, it's fascinating that.